Before we even get started, let me come clean. This wrap-up episode has taken way longer than I intended it to. I think that after 6 months of being so deeply immersed in the stories of the 1990s, I just needed more time outside of it than I really expected. Of course, I also needed to work on other things, but I just wasn't exactly sure what I wanted this episode to be. Do I just recap what I've already said? Do I mention the important names in a sense we didn't get to? Should it be what climbers can take away from the season, or what I learned while making it? The subtitle for this show is Climbing's Most Important Ascents. But what does important mean anyway? Is it the hardest, the most notorious, the most media coverage? Who decides what's important? And then a few weeks ago, I was debating with a friend the lessons learned through hip-hop and climbing. I also have hosted a podcast called Hip Hop Taught Me Everything, and for me, climbing and hip-hop are inseparable. So this topic is one I've spent a wild amount of time considering. But my friend made the statement, hip-hop taught me everything, climbing has taught me nothing. And now, they're entitled to their experience, same as I am, and you are, and everyone else is. But for me, that's just so far from the truth. I've learned so much from climbing that it's damn near impossible to draw brackets around it. And here's the thing about being taught or learning something. It's not only about new things you couldn't or didn't learn somewhere else. Teaching and learning often need to happen over and over. Lessons need to be reiterated and restructured and retaught and relearned. For me, climbing does that in a very visceral and physical way that almost nothing else does. And it also provides us this unique opportunity to interrogate and rethink how we've done things in the past and how we might change them in the future as active participants in shaping that future. And exactly like in hip-hop, climbing has this old guard, many of whom began to identify with the culture in the 1990s, who complain that climbing has just gotten worse because it's changed and it's just not like it was in the old days. This new breed of climber has lost the soul. They're doing it for the wrong reasons, or they're even just doing it wrong. And to that complaint, to both the hip-hop and the climbing old guard, I say yes. Yes, it has changed. But in my opinion, it's only gotten better. And maybe it's best that it move on without you. I'm Kris Hampton. You're listening to Written in Stone, Climbing's Most Important Ascents. This is finally the official end of Season 1, the 1990s. Two.
Show me the money!
That's it, brother, but you got to yell that shit!
Show me the money!
I need to feel you, Jerry!
Show me the money!
Jerry, you better yell!
Show me the money! Show me the money!
Congratulations, you're still my agent.
In 1996, Jerry Maguire, with its star-studded cast, appeared in the theaters. It included Best Supporting Actor Oscar winner Cuba Gooding Jr. and the slick-talking sports agent Jerry Maguire, played by Tom Cruise. And they're learning together that there's more to life than money. It was a hit, but more than that, it cemented itself a place in popular culture, partly because it said what we were all thinking. It was this catchphrase-filled highlighter of a feature film that put the spotlight on the absurdity of expanding athlete salaries. 24 years earlier, in 1972, NHL player Bobby Hull signed a deal with the Winnipeg Jets for $1 million, and people were dumbfounded. Sure, the deal was for 10 years, but the fans had never seen such a lofty amount bet on an athlete before. And then 7 years later, in 1979, two baseball players, Dave Parker, a Pittsburgh right fielder with a dangerous bat and powerful arm, and Nolan Ryan, a Houston pitcher who threw heat-seeking missiles, would both ink deals that averaged $1 million per year. Crazy. But they were superstars, and millions of people were willing to watch them play. And personally, if that type of money's coming into the sport, I'd rather the athletes be getting a bigger cut instead of it all going to the owners. But I digress. And over the next 2 decades, those numbers would just keep inflating. In 1996, when Cuba Gooding Jr. first says,
Show me the money.
Michael Jordan was signing what was the largest contract between an athlete and their team, $30 million for a single year. And some people thought it absolutely ludicrous. Obviously, the Chicago Bulls thought otherwise, and after winning the championship, they offered him even more the following year, $50.5 million for one season. Big names, big money. In the sport of rock climbing, though, not so much. While Jordan was ensuring his place in the history of all sports worldwide, climbing was going through a bit of a, let's call it a changing of the guard. Because at the exact same time that Jordan was negotiating for this contract, there was a 15-year-old climber who would become, essentially, our MJ. And he was on a breakout road trip across the Mountain West. Over the course of 3 weeks, in the summer of 1996, he sent 7 8B plus or 14A and harder routes, including a couple of 14Bs and a couple of first ascents. Most impressively, mixed in that run was Super Tweak, a short, steep, fingery affair first done by Boone Speed as the first 14B in the U.S. Now, Kris Sharma's ascent of Super Tweak was only the 3rd or 4th ascent, so maybe not super notable, except for the fact that he was 1, 15 years old, and 2, by doing it in only 48 hours, his was the fastest ascent by 8 days. And I think it's this trip, right in the middle of the 90s, that captures the essence of the decade so well. Here was this kid storming through the hardest routes in the country, and it would be easy, tempting even, to remember only the sins and the inevitable rise of one of the best climbers the world has ever seen. But also on that trip was a young Tommy Caldwell. And sure, he didn't send the same number of things in the same short time period that Kris did, but he was certainly right there pushing Kris. Like it or not, there was competition driving these kids. And now, if you're a hip-hop fan, and maybe if you aren't a fan, you were probably tuned in to the recent Drake versus Kendrick battle. These two MCs represent different sides of the global phenomenon that hip-hop's become. And for me, this was less about who's better, though, let's be honest, it's Kendrick, but about honoring the sport that's rapping. About being pushed to reassess, to re-engage, to reinvent, to move forward without losing the components that built this thing that we love. To display the artistry, but to do so on the field of battle. It was about competition. Kris Sharma in the mid-90s was not in a silo. In fact, there were a whole gang of young kids coming into the sport and making quick work of the hardest routes and boulders. And that zeitgeist has to count for something. Same as it did for Lynn Hill when she opened the 90s with a nuclear bomb of an ascent in the faces of men who thought it not possible. And the same as it was for Wolfgang and Ben Moon and Jibe Tribu trying to climb the hardest routes in the world. same as it was for Kendrick and Drake, for Jay-Z and Nas, for KRS-One and MC Shan. Competition. Sometimes outright, sometimes less overt, sometimes friendly, sometimes not. But competition regardless. And by the time, in 1996, when Kris Sharma was making his march toward the top, for many people, climbing had become less about adventuring into the wilderness and more about pushing our personal limits. And the advent of sport climbing and bouldering even began a revolution in the gear that we were using. Black Diamond launched the first wire gate carabiners and crash pads. The Gree changed the way we belay. And as a result, how willing we were to let loose when we climbed. Shoes had gotten softer and more downturned. The gear we use today looks very much like the gear that came into wide use in the 1990s. But the gear that came into use in the 90s was a far cry from what climbers had entered the 1980s with, because the companies and the climbers were now thinking about performance, athleticism, competition. Climbers were athletes, not just explorers. It had gone from simply counterculture to this new label of extreme sport, with the X Games showing the world who the superstars were. And let's be clear here. Without the people that came before, there is no Kris Sharma. Boone Speed, who was the best climber in the U.S. and established Super Tweak. Tony Yaniro, who established Closing Down, the first route Sharma ran through on his march across the West that July. Todd Skinner, who bolted and established Throw in the Houlihan, another route Kris made short work of. And besides being one of the leading voices for sport climbing, Todd was also one of the first climbers to explore professional climbing via sponsorship and speaking, getting paid to go climbing. Without that, we could argue maybe there's no Kris Sharma, no Adam Ondra. Without Lynn Hill and Catherine Destavel and Robin Herbesfield and Bobby Bensman, is there a Yanya Garnbrett and a Kyo Noguchi and Anna Stor? Sure. Maybe, probably, someone else is going to step up and do that work. Somebody was going to dominate competitions. Somebody would free the nose. Somebody would Red Point Action Direct. But maybe it takes 10 more years or 20. Like Alan Watts said about Smith Rock and how it came to be the place to be back then, and how Gilbert Tribou was doing his routes before he could get them done. It all happened at the right time, when it was supposed to, by the people who recognized that they were in the right place at the right time. And maybe they arrived there on the precipice of history by chance, but they didn't change history by chance. They changed history through hard work, forward-thinking vision, competition, and ultimately through a need to push their limits on whatever rocks would offer the best opportunities to fail, and finally, maybe succeed. Without all of that, there is no Kris Sharma, extreme sports rock climbing superstar on the cover of Rolling Stone. Without all of that, there's no us. Maybe. Possibly, one could argue. Hip-hop fans often play this what-if game. What if Tupac had lived? What if Biggie hadn't been killed? What about Big L and Nipsey Hussle and Left Eye? Let's do the same. What happens if Wolfgang doesn't die on the Autobahn? What if he continues on to 15A and Action Direct isn't held up on this romanticized pedestal that essentially slows the progression of grades? Nobody wanted to say that their route was harder or even as hard as Action Direct. Ben Moon pushed for his own route, Hubble, as 14C, partly because of the specter of Action Direct. And now we call Hubble 14D, along with several other routes of the era. Routes done in the mid-90s, like Alex Huber's Open Air, are contenders for the first 15A, long before Sharma finished Biography. the first 14C half of which, coincidentally, was completed in 1996, around the time Sharma was climbing every hard route in the U.S. Alex Huber has said repeatedly that he was basing his grades on what he perceived Action Direct to be, the bona fide hardest route in the world. And remember, it was essentially a slash grade at 8C+/9A. So he was likely undergrading. And if Hubble had been called 9A from the start, even when there were no 8C+s, which would shift the grades at Raventor, then where does Steve McClure land with Mutation? He called it 9A, but later Will Bosey would suggest that it's 9A+, maybe even 9B. Steve did it in 1998. What if? It's a lot of fun to think about, but we'll never definitely know. However, by playing this game, it's easy to see that it was this complex interaction of personalities and competition and rivalry and friendships that throughout the 90s pushed sport climbing forward at what seemed like a breakneck pace. And that is my first big takeaway from this season. A lesson I didn't first learn here, but one I needed reminding of. It's about the relationships, all of them, good and bad. But here's the thing. You can't have an active relationship if you just sit back in your armchair and criticize. You have to get up, get out, and find out what you're made of. Because frankly, the opinions of spectators just don't carry that much weight. They're shouting into the ether. And it's not that we won't listen. It's that they're stuck so far behind that we can't even hear them. We'll be right back. Look, we didn't even come close to telling all of the great stories of the 1990s, so I'm telling some of those to the patrons, the secret stoners. I mean, the Alpine Trilogy, 3 14A big alpine walls, all freed in the 1990s. A story of 2 Yosemite legends getting arrested on top of a big wall. The true story of It Goes, Boys. The story of how Todd Skinner discovered Rocklands and Fred Nicole's first trip to Waco Tanks, all in the 1990s. If you want those bonus episodes and more to get you through to next fall for when season 2 comes around, you can become a member of the Secret Stoners Club at patreon.com/Secret Stoners Club or by clicking the link right there in your show notes. I'll see you there. I've always really loved climbing history, but in recent years I've grown more and more critical of it. Or I guess more precisely, I've grown critical of how we use that history to hold back progress. And it's the same with my other love, hip hop. I don't want to be the old head who only listens to the old music and pines away for the old days, no matter how much it shaped me. I connected with it, I loved it, because it was a change. It was pushing against the norm. And now I want to make sure I'm growing alongside it, not becoming the spectator with an outdated, uninformed opinion who thinks it's only supposed to transform for as long as I'm willing to entertain that transformation. I can still love the old stuff while finding some of the brand new to love. And frankly, I hope hip-hop and climbing continues to change and grow and progress for long after I'm gone, for long after it's left all of us behind. And it's ironic because it's this very interrogation of our relationship with history that led to making a podcast that celebrates pieces of the same history I'm criticizing. It led to wanting to tell actual stories that required actual research and care, and yes, interrogation, which led to a whole new appreciation for the figures who played the roles they did. And I think that's exactly why I was the right person at the right time to make this show. It's not an accident that this season began with the very first episode I wrote. It was a pilot episode I'd made simply because the story seemed so important. I didn't have a home for it yet, but I knew I wanted to put it out there. I had no clue that this would become a full-blown thing. I just needed to tell the story of Lynn Hill first challenging the old guard at the Great Debate and then setting off a nuclear chain reaction in the face of Gilbert Trabue. And it's not because I had some vendetta against Trabue. I suspect he just happened to be the one saying what a lot of men were thinking. Men who could conveniently change their tune after Lynn shut that shit down. It's not a coincidence that the first episode I wrote of Hip Hop Taught Me Everything was about Lauryn Hill and her battle against a male superstar, Wyclef Jean. Hip hop had and has a misogyny problem. The world in general has that problem. Climbing isn't immune to it, and I needed to point out that the old way it was done was not the best way. We haven't reached the best way yet. And because I believe that if you're actually passionate about something, if you love something, it's your duty to criticize it. Sometimes while celebrating it. And it's not an accident that mid-season we highlighted the phrase, "It goes, boys," because while the history of that phrase probably isn't what you think it is, a fact we're going to do a bonus episode on for the patrons, it is still perfectly symbolic of what women were dealing with at the time, in sports, in business, and pretty much everywhere else. Lynn was carrying a torch lit way before it was handed to her by Bev Johnson and Mariah Cranor. Sure, she was absolutely doing these hard climbs because she loved climbing, same as Catherine McKell and Yosune Bereziartu, who both carried that torch and who both never set out to be female firsts, but also couldn't help but recognize how monumental it was when they found themselves in that position. And you know, I talked with another podcast host who had heard the first episode and was concerned that I might be making a feminist caricature of Lynn. And to be clear, I took great care in making sure that Lynn had openly made feminism a part of her platform before I assigned that role to her. But regardless, Lynn was rebelling against the patriarchy just by being the badass that she was. And this is just one story, one little blip in a much bigger life, the life of a mother, a friend, a mentor. People can be and are more than just one thing. They have more than one belief, sometimes even walking contradictions. But it doesn't mean that we can't celebrate them for some specific thing. And we have to celebrate them for that in any way we can, because we only have to look at the best female sport climber and best female boulder of the late 1990s to see that the media wasn't doing it. The outlets that we held up as some sort of Bible weren't telling us the whole story. They were picking and choosing, building heroes and making sure not to build others, which I suppose is their right. I have to do it for this podcast, and we have the right to criticize the media of yesteryear, which frankly isn't much different than the media of today, same as it's your right to criticize my choices. I mean, I question my own choices all the time. It's really fucking hard to make a list of what's most important when your definition of important keeps changing. Let's take Fred Nicole as an example. Fred was and is an artist. Or is he an athlete? Why can't he be both? Why can't he elevate both the sport and the art of bouldering? Why can't both things be important? Why can't sport and art coexist? Well, they can, whether the old guard wants them to or not. The people who were influenced by Fred, even if they were influenced by only one aspect, let's say the artistry, since that's what the old guard seems to believe is the most important, those people weren't influenced to always climb easy things in exceptional style. Sure, they were taking an artistic view like Fred did, but they still challenged themselves to climb harder things. That's part of Fred's legacy, that he pushed the sport forward in terms of grade and difficulty. It's not the only part, not by a long shot, but it's an undeniable one. And speaking of undeniable, maybe the biggest hurdle of the season was for me to figure out what to do with Alex Huber. On one hand, he seemed like this larger-than-life superhero due to Jeff Aki's cover article about him in Climbing Magazine. And he was certainly one of the best climbers of the era. That's not debatable. But I couldn't ignore the way he treated other climbers who made big claims, even when those climbers had proven themselves over and over. It's like he was afraid his own spotlight would dim if he was forced to share it with anyone else claiming to climb as hard. And so I took a step back. If that article in Climbing Magazine had never been published, were Alex Huber's ascents still important? Sure they were. Of course they were. Were they of the 10 most important? The majority of them? In my opinion, no. But I also couldn't delete him from the cultural shift that was freerider. And believe me, I tried. But despite the fascinating actual history of the route, his name still had to ring out as key to that defining moment. And it hurt me a little bit to do it, but I did it anyway. And I guess that brings me to my second takeaway. We should absolutely learn from history. We should celebrate history. But we can't stand in the way of this thing we love moving on. We can't afford to let our love of that history hold us back from progress, because that is exactly how cultures die. While I was making the music for this season, I was using a technique known as sampling, taking other musicians' compositions and pieces of sound from history and rearranging them into this whole new thing. And sampling was one of the foundational building blocks of hip-hop. But as hip-hop grew, those musicians who were being sampled, or more precisely, the record labels that owned the samples, wanted to be paid. Rightfully so. And so sampling changed with new rules and new monetary expectations. Whether it changed for the better or not is debatable. And because it got more expensive, as time went on, sampling fell out of favor for many artists and hip-hop evolved. But the music stayed great, and we can celebrate that music that wasn't made using that piece of the bedrock of early hip-hop. And it's the artists who've combined that traditional sampling done legally with live musicians, as well as being open to new ways of sampling, who are and will be heralded as defining artists. The same way we can look at climbers of today who may not really know who Fred Nicole is or what he did, but can still feel his influence and who build off of his artistry and his athleticism to make change in their own way. And we can celebrate those new climbers and those new methods and those new philosophies as well. And I guess the hard part is that we have to look beyond the popular rhetoric and try to uncover what it is that actually shifts things, what actually changes the culture. Can we pinpoint it? Maybe, but maybe not. We probably get it wrong far more than we get it right, but we still have to try. And I decided to try to shine a light on the things that changed this culture that we all love over sampled, legally I might add, music inspired by 1990s hip-hop. And I did that because hip-hop might have taught me everything, but so did climbing. And I'll keep celebrating both as a fan, as a spectator, and for as long as I can, as a participant. Written in Stone is produced by me, Kris Hampton, with help from Riley Rush and Emily Holland for Plug Tone Audio, a group of the best, most impactful podcasts in the outdoor industry. And look, this show is 100% rooted in the facts, but like Todd Skinner always said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. We are starting on season 2 right now, and I'm not going to tell you what decade we're covering just yet, though I will be telling the patrons, the stoners, very soon. And I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to first say thanks to all of you for listening and making this thing bigger than I ever thought it could be, but also to say thanks to Tension Climbing for so generously helping season 1 come to fruition. The fact that you all believed in this vision was a big boost for me, so thank you. And just because season 1 is officially over does not mean you should stop telling your friends about the show. Let everybody know. And if you haven't yet, please give us that 5-star rating and a glowing review, and I will see you in a few months for season 2. And together, we can tell the stories of climbing's most important ascents, one decade at a time.